Hello, everyone.
Music and the lights. Hang on.
First show.
We're gonna get settled.
Adjusting the music and the lights. My name is Kate. I am the director of events across all of the McNally Jackson stores, and I started 3 weeks ago.
They're telling us. She's amazing.
Tonight we're in for a real treat. A conversation between Jennifer Egan, Katie Kitamura, Tess Gunty for the literary podcast Burned by Books, 150th episode. Most podcasts do not make it to 150 episodes. That's really huge. These authors will be joined by the host of the show, Chris Holmes. They will talk about the power of creative writing in times of crisis, as well as their vision for fiction and other genres in the perilous decades to come. The episode will be available online after the event. First up, we have Jennifer Egan, whose novel, The Candy House, a companion to A Visit from the Goon Squad, was named one of the New York Times 10 Best Books of 2022 and one of President Obama's favorite reads of the year. Tess Gunty is the author of the New York Times bestselling novel, The Rabbit Hutch, which received the National Book Award for Fiction. Her second novel, Honeydew, is forthcoming from Knopf. Katie Kitamura's most recent novel, Intimacies, was one of the New York Times 10 Best Books of 2021 and was longlisted for the National Book Award and the Ben Faulkner Award. Her new novel, Audition, will be published by Riverhead in 2025. And Chris Holmes is the chair of English and an associate professor at Ithaca College. He writes essays on contemporary literature, and his book, Kazuo Ishiguro Against World Literature, will be published in November with Bloomsbury. So give it up for our guests. And we hope you'll join us downstairs for an after party and signing. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Emma and Kate and everybody at McNally Jackson who have been so hospitable and didn't look at me askance when I said, can we come here and do this episode, even though they had no idea who I was. Luckily, I have these three amazing writers who I can't believe I'm sitting on the stage with them because they are three of the most important writers to me working today, and I had the chance to interview them before, and I'm very lucky to be able to do it again. Thank you for all for being here, my family, my friends, former students, members of the other podcasts that I get to work on, Novel Dialogue, which is an amazing experience of its own. All of you, thank you so much for being here this evening. And this is a real dream to celebrate the 150th episode of a podcast that I thought would last 5 episodes. It started in COVID, in the midst of the worst time in COVID, as a way to not go crazy, and has sort of spun its own yarn from there. So thank you for being here, and thank you for being in conversation. And we should jump in. So I'm going to start with a question about how stories make us feel things. The viscerality of the novel, its ability to evoke something at the gut level, its materiality, the way a novel makes us feel that it rents space in our heads. The three of you deal in the visceral, and I would argue that you evoke it through formal and structural play in your work. Tess's The Rabbit Hutch is an apartment complex filled with a cacophony of voices and interiorities. Jennifer's Candy House plays with the rhythms and moods of electronic dance music. And Katie takes up translation as a method and metaphor for interpreting human interaction. Do you experience the materiality of your own fictional worlds as you write? And do you see yourself as crafting that experience for the reader?
Oh no. I'm not sure. Is it working? Yeah. I guess if I stay in exactly the right place, it works. I guess I'm going to back up and address something you said a little bit earlier in that question, which is where the power of fiction comes versus other forms of entertainment. And for me, it has something to do with the fact that it's happening without images. I mean, specifically the thing that sort of endangers it in our current media landscape, for me, is the very source. It's tricky. Yeah. Is for me the source of its power, that it sort of interacts with our minds on the level of thought and language being so kind of fundamental to and intertwined with thought itself. And so I think that for me, that I write not for my own life, but with a desire to basically escape and even on a good day kind of transcend my own life. And that's really also why I read. And I think for me, the materiality of that experience, which isn't really a word I've thought of exactly, but I think I'm talking about the same thing that you mean, Chris, has something to do with the fact that I am experiencing it, whether reading or writing, over time without pictures and inherently starting on the interior rather than the exterior. Sometimes I often think of it as, if you're looking at an image, you are by definition on the outside. And forms of entertainment that use images use all kinds of bells and whistles to give you the feeling that you're on the inside, but you're really not. And so for me, fiction actually captures human experience on a more primal interior level, and that's what gives it its power.
Sorry. Thank you so much. Thanks, Jen. I mean, before coming out today, is it the way I'm holding it?
No, no.
Okay. I just dipped a little bit back into the candy house and into the rabbit hutch just because I was so excited to be speaking with these two today. And one thing that really struck me, which is maybe linked to this question of materiality, is how much reading both those books it's really being plunged into a world, and it's these worlds that kind of unfold and have an almost cathedral-like, they have a space, you're kind of ushered into a space, and that space is happening inside of the reader, and that's incredibly powerful to me. There's a kind of, you feel like you're vaulting through air when you read books like that, and that is, to me, what is deeply moving about the best books, is that there is something that does feel almost like a physical experience, even though it's all just happening inside of you, is just made of ideas and language and images, but at the same time, there's something that is almost escapes language. I'm not really sure I'm making much sense, but there was something I couldn't quite. Sorry.
No, I'm really sorry. We might actually scoot you forward a little bit because the receivers are over there. Sorry, everyone. So sorry. Get up close and personal. Thank you so much. Okay, let's try that.
I guess the only thing I would add is that I'm always interested in the kind of materiality of language, of this kind of idea that language leaves a residue, that the people who speak it, the people who hear it, change it in some way. That's something that I try to write about. I try to write about the kind of limits of language and moments when it kind of is no longer clearly signifying one thing or another, but is becoming something a bit looser and amorphous. That's kind of interesting to me. But in relation to the books that I really love as a reader, there is almost a physical elation that I get from reading them that feels to me like, I'll try to lean forward, that feels to me almost expansive in some way, and that's where the emotion is for me. It's not kind of feeling sad because of characters. It's not rooted in empathy in some way, it's rooted in something that's much more immersive and harder for me to articulate.
Well, we'll see how this one goes. Yeah, it's interesting that your books are all about language passing through another consciousness, and then how that is filtered and distilled into a different form of expression. I think this is something that I read for very often. It's it's the poem, I think it's called "Sharing a Coke with You" by Frank O'Hara, and it's Susan Snaps. I think I said that. Yeah. I think the image of sharing a Coke, specifically this kind of immediate sensory engagement of a particular of a particular product in our world is so effective right away. You immediately feel more than you would if you just said, it's nice to be around this person. You know, you wouldn't feel the same kind of sensory intimacy with that person if he didn't evoke a very particular and relatable sensory experience. And so I think that's something that I now that I'm teaching, I also try to emphasize when I'm giving feedback, kind of like, if there's an emotion that's expressed through direct language, is there something in the material world that we could pull from to indicate that emotion rather than simply saying, I'm sad, can you say their skin felt cold? Or, I mean, that's a terrible example actually, but is there something material that we can evoke to accomplish the same, to communicate the same idea but much more effectively, and kind of like that race to the bottom of the brainstem?
Those were all amazing responses. I wanted to cue off of something that Katie said about it not being empathy necessarily or all the time that brings you to a certain sense of the material of the text. And I'm very interested in how each of your most recent books is not necessarily sort of invested in a kind of empathy project. It's interested often in discomfort. And having the readers have to experience not understanding, not being fully comprehending of relationships, language, the planes of experience that others have and claim as their own. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about discomfort in the novel as something that is not necessarily a negation of empathy, but something that doesn't get talked about in the same way that we've talked about for hundreds of years, the idea of the novel as an agency-building machine.
Well, I have to say, I do know that people experience discomfort reading my books, but I'm never happy to hear it, honestly. I mean, it's really not what I'm hoping for. So I think it's sort of it's a side effect of some of the choices that I end up making to try to tell the stories that I'm telling. So, I mean, for example, in the Candy House, what a source of discomfort is that I'm asking, as with the Visit from the Goon Squad, I'm asking the reader to start over in a certain sense every single chapter. So that's actually asking a lot. There's always a connection to the previous chapter, but it sometimes isn't immediately obvious, and each chapter is written in a different way. But the way I've tried, I think often about how to mitigate that discomfort or sort of even the balance of what I'm expecting from the reader. And in the case of these books, each chapter stands completely on its own, and that's one of the criteria that I have for even using something in one of these books. So the way I think of it is with the kind of symmetry that I'm asking the reader to start over every time, but I'm also supplying a complete experience every time. I think about the earliest novels like Tristram Shandy or Don Quixote, and these are books that are so wild. I mean, they're really what we would call postmodern, experimental. They pull all kinds of different literary genres, really everything available, legal documents, letters, graphic elements. So to me, the novel has always been a form that could absorb anything the culture had and bend it to the purpose of storytelling. Sometimes there's a kind of discomfort in understanding what the novelist is doing, and sort of a kind of a little bit of a process of acclimation to whatever the strategy is. But my hope always is that sheer entertainment takes over, and what I want is for people to feel lost and really caught up in it. And if that doesn't happen, it is I regard that as my failure, not theirs.
I don't experience discomfort when I read your books, but I do experience real joy when I have that moment of connection where I figure out the kind of link between the chapters. And to some extent, I think a lot of the writing that I love is willing to, maybe discomfort isn't the right word, or it is a word, but it's willing to, you go through a little bit of that and then you leap much higher the reward is very, very high for that little bit of friction, maybe, that a writer is willing to introduce into the reading process. And I think
Friction is a much better
no,
word,
just
I think.
but I think, I feel a little that way about empathy. I think empathy is really, really seductive. I think empathy, the word relatable comes up. I mean, Tess and I teach on the same program, and the word relatable often comes up when you're teaching, as if that's inherently a positive thing. I do think, of course, that kind of this kind of empathetic powers of the novel is an important thing. But sometimes, I mean, my book is very much about the dangers of empathy. It's about a character who is a simultaneous interpreter for a war criminal, and at a certain point she finds herself all too empathetic, in a way all too porous, and she loses a kind of boundary of herself and her sense of moral standing because of almost an excess of empathy. And so I'm interested in, I think empathy is a natural impulse as a reader, just like as a reader it's probably your natural impulse to read in a linear fashion. I'm kind of interested in books that trouble that relationship, that make you question whether empathy is always inherently ethical. And I think we really do live in a world where, I have a small son, and the amount of traffic that social media feeds me about raising an empathetic son is very, very high. But is that really is empathy the same as morality? I'm not sure that it necessarily is, even though it is clearly central to a lot of the kind of big ethical dilemmas of our time. But I think fiction is a place where you can trouble binaries and you can inhabit a kind of more ambiguous space, and so that's always what I'm interested in doing. And I think I probably do put my readers in a position of discomfort. I mean, so it's the mic gave up on me just as I said that. But I find myself like when I'm writing, if the sentences are coming too quickly and too fluidly, I become a bit suspicious, because I feel like as a writer, it's almost like I feel like I'm in danger of the vanity of falling into like the rhythm of my own prose, and at that moment I'm always trying to kind of slow down and put a little bit more friction, a little bit of sand into the, I can't come up with a metaphor. The sand into the, what are they called, the gears. Thank you. into the gears, and just kind of trouble things a little bit. Stop now.
So much to say. I think that I've been thinking about how the entry point to true kind of radical empathy is actually much more aligned with just honestly observing something rather than trying to impose a kind of a superficial form of charitability, filtering everything through this kind of superficially charitable lens. I think that the most radical acts of compassion require a person to see all of the ugliness in something else, all of the violence, all of the problematic parts of something. And so I guess I think of these things, putting a reader through discomfort and an empathetic portrayal, not at all. I think of them as not as mutually dependent actions. And it's striking that both of you in your books, though they're so different, dive into perspectives that are really, really different from the ones that you occupy. And yet I think that you conjure them so effectively because you see these people dimensionally. It wouldn't be effective if you were filtering every single character through this kind of perfect, a lens of superficial sympathy all the time. It evokes empathy because of the kind of clear-eyed observation. And I don't think you can have one without the other. And I think fiction is engaged with that kind of really, really demanding, uncomfortable, painful form of empathy. To me, these are not opposed.
I want to talk for a second about the novel and its relationship to solutions, which is not a word that we hear a lot when we think about fiction and storytelling. But I was prompted to think about this because of Jenny's incredible reportage on homelessness in the New Yorker, titled Off the Street. If you haven't read it, it's extraordinary. And to vulgarly summarize it, we could say that we know what the solutions are to helping the unhoused. All that is missing is a will and money and a government that is willing to have the institutions and care required. But it made me think that the novel is a form that is often thought of in terms of its open-endedness, its ambiguities, its things that don't point at one solution or another. And I'm thinking of Tess, you dramatizing the failures of the foster care system in the Rabbit Hutch, and Katie delving into the problems of adjudicating state violence on an international scale. And I think of, the critic Peter Hitchcock has written that novels should not be expected to solve the problems of nations, but are there conditions under which they might be asked to, when other forms of societal reaction fail to do so? Can we ask fiction to put forth solutions that we know are capable of enacting societal change?
Well, so I have a lot of thoughts about that. And I guess the primary one is that I personally really dislike didactic fiction. I do not like being taught a lesson. And there's a reason I tackled the problem of homelessness as a journalist and not as a fiction writer, although I will say I thought about the Rabbit Hutch a lot as I followed, the lives of many people who were having extreme experiences living in adjacent apartments. I mean, it was almost uncanny, actually, sometimes. It just made me think about how, a whole world, so many worlds happen so close together and with no awareness of each other. Anyway, so I personally am not a big fan of fiction that I think is trying to teach me anything. Maybe it's just the sort of rebellious kid in me still that feels like, no, this is supposed to be fun. But that said, I think that, fiction writers are following the same laws of logic that real life is following. So there are all kinds of interesting things we can learn from looking at where the imagination takes us. For example, with regard to technology, or what you were just saying about, empathizing with the point of view of dictators. All of this feels incredibly relevant. And I think that fiction can can prompt us, not make us, prompt us to reflect on our realities without trying to teach us, but simply by imagining along the same lines of logic that are at work in the real world.
Thank you. I agree with Jenny in that I think on the whole fiction that has a agenda is rarely the fiction that I'm naturally drawn to. Clearly there are exceptions, like, Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, that fundamentally changed like the legal system in some ways, and I actually think it's a great novel as well. But one thing that I think novels do very, very well is depict the relationship between the individual and the institution. And I think simply articulating what it is like for the individual to experience the structure and power of an institution, whether it's foster care or whatever else it might be, is in and of itself already, if not a solution, it's a step towards a solution, because so often a big part of the problem is invisibility of certain people within the community, of certain facts even, and I think that actually a novel does very well and can do it without falling into being kind of didactic in any way. I don't know that it's necessarily offering policy solutions, but in some ways the policy solutions are there. It's actually generating the will to enact them, and I think visibility and simply making people look and acknowledge the reality of what people are going through. Strangely, I think novels do that very, very well. I'm thinking of Rachel Kushner's The Mars Room as well. I think is an excellent novel as a novel, but I also think it has a incredible power as a kind of political action as well.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and there's a quote from Kavi Akbar that I don't remember exactly, but it's something about how narrative restores specificity to data, and I think about that a lot. And I think you're right that it's actually not about enacting policy solutions. It's more about, I mean, like a successful socially engaged novel cannot be reached if an author has this kind of condescending moral agenda to impose upon. I agree. I'm also very averse to didactic fiction because it feels like the author is condescending to you, that the author has a kind of a right opinion that it's trying to force you into. And that is something that an essay does well. I mean, an essay is not hiding its argument, it's trying to make an argument. It's an argumentative form. It can be, but a novel, it's more like an immersive, it's when people talk about how making novels more efficient, or that language is always confusing to me because it's like, well, I want my mechanic to be efficient, but I don't want like my stroll in this park to be efficient. You know, there are things that are immersive experiences that are meant to change you because they are not meant to be optimized or made efficient. And so I think about it's sort of like the novel is reacting to a failure in our brains. Like there's this failure in the human brain to interpret really abstract data or like large numbers, but you can see one child without an arm in the arms of their father and be completely changed by that image. And so I think novels are there to kind of bridge the gap between maybe between data and our monkey brains.
Yeah, although I'm looking forward to my first poetic experience with a mechanic, so I hope that comes soon. And what you seem to be sort of hinting us at is the question of scale with data and how things get lost in the kind of the macro scale of data things. This many people suffering this thing, and that the novel can think in ways that are so fine-grained about data that feels deep personified and abstract and numb. And so perhaps is a better way to think about, rather than solution, can we think about the scale issue? And that's certainly something that I think climate fiction writers and thinkers are talking a lot about. You can't understand the scale of temperature change planetary-wide, but you can understand chaos and loss on a finite, even sort of a domestic level. So might that be a better way to think about something that the novel's really good at, is changing scale?
I mean, you're referring to Timothy Morton. Are you referring to Timothy Morton?
Yeah.
And kind of hyper objects and things that are a kind of a philosophy of thought that things like climate change are beyond the human ability to even take in. And can the novel in some way?
Yeah, can it change the scalar principle of something that's too big to take in? And that can be climate change, but it can also be atrocity. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like Ruth Ozeki has written about this quite a lot in her fiction, and in her last book, I'm quite tired, so I forgot. Is it the book of the name of the book of? This is very embarrassing. Does anybody know
Everybody knows. What is it?
Form and Emptiness.
The book of Form and
Emptiness.
Emptiness. She speaks specifically about the kind of derangement of scale and how there's a kind of, but in fact I think she's almost moving in an opposite direction, where she's saying there's a kind of what we need to do is think about the hubris to assume. She's talking specifically about the moment when this famous image of the Earth from space, and suddenly it becomes this precious thing that you can almost hold in your hand, the human impulse to believe that we can control the fate of Earth. And she's saying that actually that is counterproductive to actually understanding. I think that's what she's saying, the true scale of what is unfolding, and that actually means instead moving away from a purely human point of view, a kind of centering of human experience, and instead towards centering other kinds of consciousnesses, whether they're animal or plant. plant-based, not plant, or plant which I find really, really exciting. But of course, she's doing that in a novel, and she's doing that with her human brain. And I think that's such a kind of beautiful example of how there is a novelist, a novelist who's thinking very precisely about this question of scale that I think you're asking about.
I'm going to move us to a question that has some ironies to it, and that is that the novel more and more is, and novelists are thinking about how to represent digital life and the incursion of all things digital into our ways of being and our ways of communing with one another. Obviously, Jenny is doing that so directly with the Candy House, but each of you are taking up the notion of our digital lives, whether that's something as simple as we text to communicate, or something more like dissolving into the scrolling life of digital images, going back to Jenny's point about the novel not being mostly not an imagistic form, although at the end of The Rabbit Hutch we get some extraordinary images. But can you think a little bit about how you approach digital life and the growing sense that we cannot represent human life without its technological partners?
I don't think too much directly about digital life, but I think that my fascination with technological change is with me always, and some of that is honestly just my generation. I mean, I'm from the tail end of the boomers, and from the time that I was born to when I was 18, there was one telecommunications change, which was call waiting. I mean, and that was huge, because up until then, you made a phone call and either someone answered, or it rang and rang and rang, or you got a busy signal. And when I first told my children that, they were so agog to even think of such a thing that one of them asked if we had electricity. So, that's where I started. And so, it's impossible not to think about digital experience just because it's so interwoven at this point with human experience. But I say that as someone who's actually not very interested in it experientially. Like, I am someone who kind of goes a little numb with screens. I don't particularly, I'm not drawn to them. I'm sort of, in a way, repelled by them. But there's no way not to be. I feel like it's the big story that I've really witnessed in my life. So it comes up again and again. And I guess the thing that, as a journalist, I sometimes encounter things that make me think differently, and this is one reason I love to do journalism, make me think differently or ask different questions about the world and and how we relate to technology. And to give you one example, in 2000, I wrote a story about the secret out lives that closeted gay teens were living online. So this was before social media. There were like bulletin boards on AOL. And I ended up getting in touch with a whole network of teens whom I could never meet, and who regarded their online lives as their real lives and referred to them as such, and their physical lives as their fake lives, because no one knew who they really were, and in fact they believed they might be murdered in some cases if it were to come out that they were gay. And yet, their so-called real lives were just fraught with deception. There were adults posing as kids. There were groups of kids who turned out to be just one adult, sort of playing with a teen. So that paradox, the openness and the possibility of digital life, coupled with the deceptions that went along with the fact that you really never know exactly whom you're talking to, led me to really write a gothic thriller about disembodied communication, which is really what the Gothic is all about, and also what digital life is all about, called The Keep. And I don't think that ever would have happened if I hadn't been in touch with these teens and hearing about this. So I think for me, the interest of digital life, it comes from learning about how much it means and what it means to people who are often a lot younger than I am. And so it's, there's no way not to be fascinated by the impact of digital life?
Yeah, I think I agree. It's in the air we breathe, and it changes the way we think. It changes the way certainly I spend all my time. The nature of my attention absolutely has been changed by digital culture. It's funny. I don't think I write about it directly, but its vocabulary and its motifs totally infiltrate my fiction. Like this is I almost did it as a joke, but then it became very serious. In my last book, there's a character who kind of is in a relationship with the narrator and then kind of disappears. And my idea was that I would take this phenomenon of ghosting, which is very, very common online, and turn it into a material reality in a kind of embodied relationship. And to my surprise, it was almost the thing that troubled people the most in the book. So like there is in the book there is a war criminal who has performed terrible acts and is responsible for genocide. But often people would talk to me about the villain of the book, and they would be talking about the man who had ghosted. And so that kind of there was something. I think it's a little experience that is still common for almost everybody has experienced it in some form online, and then it was kind of interesting to try to nudge it into a more embodied reality and see, and the reaction was very, very strong to it. So I think there's all kinds of ways in which, digital culture is changing the way we write. I mean, there's a kind of fractal quality that I love in a lot of fiction that I'm reading now that I think has been influenced by online culture. I think some of my favorite moments in recent books, I love in Ben Lerner's, I guess it's not that recent now, but in Leaving the Atocha Station, the chatting section is just one of my favorite moments in recent contemporary fiction, and that is because he's taking a piece of technology, he's taking something that's a part of the fabric of our everyday life, and then he's just turning it into an extraordinary moment of storytelling, actually. So I don't think I write about it as directly as many people, but I definitely love reading about it.
There's also an international tribunal for men who ghost, but it's in Brooklyn.
Well, speaking of transforming digital spheres into incredible acts of storytelling, that PowerPoint chapter in Visit from the Goon Squad, it's so hard for me to attend this event as a participant rather than attending, because I read all of your work, both of your work, as I was writing my book, and it was incredibly influential. And I remember actually dropping my book onto the floor when I got to the PowerPoint chapter because it was so electrifying. I was just like, you can do that? And it was so effective because it destabilizes expectations of narrative, and then it kind of makes you even more raw as a reader to what is being narrated and what is being communicated. And I think novels have always been really invested in modes of communication, ways in which communication breaks down. I mean, letter formats were some of the earliest forms of the novel. The novel took the form of letter exchanges in its very early forms, and I think when you read work that was created in the Industrial Revolution, during the Industrial Revolution, whether it's Dickens or another these writers who were simply attending to and observing the effects of these massive changes on their environment without prescribing any kind of solution or opinion about them, end up being really important artifacts of social change or material change over time. Thinking about all the soot in Dickens, I mean, it's just so much soot, and rarely is that like a crucial plot point, but it's present in a way that makes you trust that this is someone paying attention to what's going on in their environment. And I think that's always the writer's job, is to simply pay attention to what is going on in their environment.
I'm getting the signal that we should move soon to questions from the audience, but I want to quick, because it's an important part of Burned by Books, is asking for recommendations. Would you each offer one book that you've been reading and loving recently? And it doesn't have to be current, and it can be any genre, but I'm sure everyone would love to know what you're reading.
I really loved Colored Television by Dancy Senna. It is so much fun. It's really sharp satire and laugh out loud funny, and as sort of a send up of television and Hollywood, and actually, you know, raises the question of why a fiction writer would write fiction rather than write for television, for example. It's just delicious. I can't recommend it too highly.
I will second the recommendation of Colored Television. I was actually reading it in like before I fall asleep at bed, and I was laughing so much that my husband said, "What are you reading?" And he actually was feeling slightly jealous because I kept saying, "I haven't laughed this much in years," and he was really like, "Oh." But that is the power of Dancy Senna. But to give another book, Han Kang, the Korean writer who just won the Nobel, she has a new book that is coming, well, not a new book, a book that will be newly in English translation called We Do Not Part, which is coming out in January, which I think is really extraordinary. I think it's one of her best books, and I've always felt about her that she's a writer who kind of operates in almost two registers. There's this kind of very visceral, almost flamboyant fiction that she writes along the lines of incredibly ambitious and highly stylized, like The Vegetarian or Human Acts. And then there's this very, very quiet, minimal register she also has, which is in a book like The White Book, which is a very, very slim, almost like a prose poem in a way. And this is a book where I think they really come together in a way that is electrifying, these kind of two modes, and I think it's a completely astonishing book.
I've been recommending this book for a while now, but Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad, which I'm sure many of you have read, but it was published a few years ago, and I'm rereading it now because I'm about to teach it for a class on ghost stories, and I think it has all the immersive pleasures and the sort of pacing of fiction that seems almost of another time period, and yet it also is an incredible portrait of it follows a group of Palestinian actors as they're trying to perform a very politicized performance of Hamlet in occupied West Bank, and this was written before Netanyahu's invasion of Gaza. So it's a kind of ear to the ground book. I thought it's both just a pleasure to read it because it is so immersive and so well told, and it's also, I think, a really important kind of context for everything that's happening.
Thank you for those recommendations. I'm happy to call on a few folks for questions, and what we'll do is I'll repeat your question so we can grab it via the audio. So, yeah, in the back there.
Hi, my name is Aziza. Thank you all for coming here. I love all three of your work so much, so I'm really happy to have you in the same room. My question is sort of piggybacking on what you talked about with digital found text, like in the novel. I found in a lot of contemporary novels, we often see like sort of digital fragments being integrated into the text, like via PowerPoint or, you know, comments on like a funeral website or something. But I've rarely seen so far novels that like push this form to the fullest, where it's like full digital, at least in the way it's told. So I'm curious to hear your opinion on like whether that's possible, or if we need to sort of supplement with more traditional narrative structures, or if you know any writers who've done that I would love to read. Thank you.
Thank you. So the question is about, are there writers who are sort of moving into a kind of a full digital form or way of engagement in the novel, or is there still the necessity of kind of older narrative forms to stitch together maybe that kind of digital aesthetic?
I'm definitely the least qualified person on this panel, and I shouldn't be speaking first, but I just want to quickly say, I mean Patricia Lockwood's novel, I don't know what is going on with my brain and titles. Nobody's talking about this? Nobody's talking about, which has kind of, it has sustained across the novel, is I think, in kind of tweet form. But of course, right now Sheila Heti is working on a novel, working with an AI, and I've heard her read sections of it, and I think it's really extraordinary. And that is an AI that she's been training, and I think she has been integrating pieces of, in my understanding, is pieces that include her own prompts, which are pieces of her writing, but she's taking these transcripts and putting together something that it does feel really strange, but at the same time very recognizably something that's authored by Sheila Heti, which is kind of a mysterious and wonderful thing.
I'm not totally sure what full digital would mean. I mean, speaking as somebody who's written, works in Twitter and PowerPoint and all electronic communication, I mean, I don't know why I'm holding a pen. right on my leg. But to me, I mean, in the end, I want to read a story that's compelling, and so. I'm just speaking personally, only interested in reading or writing anything that is engaging on that level. And what I have found fun about using digital forms is specifically the fact that they let me tell stories that I couldn't have told any other way. So for example, the PowerPoint chapter, PowerPoint is actually very hard to use to write fiction. People accused me, they said, oh, no one's gonna write, our kids are never gonna write anything but PowerPoint. And I thought, yeah, let's let them try. The reason that it's so hard, there were two specific reasons. One is it's a totally inert, there's no way to portray action in PowerPoint. It's a completely atomized form. It's one moment and then another moment and then another moment. And the other thing is that it has a cold corporate vibe because it's basically a corporate tool. And so what those elements, I really struggled to find a way to write in PowerPoint, but when I finally was able to do it, I think it was because I landed on a story that is actually very sentimental and that would be unbearable written conventionally, and in which almost nothing happens. So it's and that was thrilling because I got to tell this very sweet story that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise tell, in which almost nothing happens, but that's okay because there's no way to make anything happen in this form. So I guess what I'm really saying is that in the end, any genre, including any genre offered by the digital world, to my mind anyway, is only as good as the story you end up being able to tell with it. And in the end, if all that's interesting about it is that it's digital, that's gimmickry. It's rarely compelling. So I'm very curious to see what Sheila Heti will do. She's the perfect person to do it, and I loved No One Is Talking About This, but No One Is Talking About This made me cry at the end because it's a really powerful and moving human story. So in the end, we gotta have those human beings, or it's I don't think gonna be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'd just say briefly that one thing that might engage that sort of full digital is the idea of immediacy, because I know during the height of COVID, especially in Latin America, there were writers experimenting with Twitter form stories that they called microcuentes, and they felt that they were more able to deal with the kind of immediate moment by moment kind of tragedy and power of what they were observing, rather than having to go through a kind of publishing process. So rather than like a full digital vision of something before you, rather that the digital can create an immediacy of rather old forms of narrative.
I mean, yeah, I think about how language is also a technology, and when people started writing things down for the first time, it wasn't Aristotle who was all up in arms about how this was going to ruin memory and no one would ever remember it. So I think you can argue that the novel has always been a kind of record of technology, and specifically communicative technology, and I think that you're right. I mean, if you had a novel written in letters that was just about letter writing, it was about the fact that they were writing letters, it wouldn't be interesting, it wouldn't work. It has to still, no matter what format you're using, it has to still activate these very material human realities, or won't be effective.
Another question? Yeah, in the back.
This is for Ms. Egan, but if the other two have one off the top of their mind, of course, please jump in. Do you have a personal favorite rock and roll pause?
A personal favorite rock and roll Pause?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think I would have to say the Doobie Brothers' Long Train Runnin'. I just love that song so much. And one thing, I became so hungry for pauses and so appreciative of pauses that almost all pauses seem too short to me. I feel like, come on, go further. But also readers have sent me really good songs with pauses. So, there's I really love pauses in songs. But yes, that's a great one. Love that pause. Actually, I'll add one more. David Bowie, Young Americans. But as my character says in Goon Squad, it is a little too short. And when I'm sure David Bowie had his very good reasons for making the pause the length that it is, but my character rails against the brevity of the pause. And John Schaefer, the amazing music reporter for NPR, played another version of the song in which he elongated the pause to see how we liked it, and it sounded really good with the Just saying.
This is picking up on something you said, Katie, in terms of like morality versus empathy. And also tying in this kind of digital trend. We live in an era, obviously, where it's ever easier to have different moralities clash in digital media. And I guess in terms of the role of the novel and its future, probably always think optimistically or pessimistically about it. I guess, do you have any thoughts in terms of what would be the role of the novel in its clash with the other medias that are ever more behind?
So the role of the novel as it encounters and clashes with other media, and how it might be forecasted or thinking about it positively or negatively.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was earlier in the conversation, I was thinking about, when we were talking about different technologies, I was actually thinking about two of my favorite novels, which are very novelty novels, which actually have so much anxiety about new forms of technology, which is The Bostonians by Henry James, which has a lot of anxiety about newspaper culture and print culture, and then Lolita, which has a lot of anxiety about film, cinema culture as a whole. And the result is two extremely novelty novels by two very novelty novelists. And I know, clearly I'm a novelist. I should be worried about the death of the novel, which I am told about all the time. But it does feel like a robust technology. And actually, I think people are stretching it so much. I mean, my husband was telling me he's been reading these kind of online collective novels that are being written by multiple people contributing, so that they're kind of crowdsourced novels, and the form survives that. It survives being written. You can do all kinds of things to it, and it still persists somehow as a form. And oddly, people love the book, which is a surprising thing. I feel like books are becoming. I mean, I shouldn't say this because I don't know what the numbers are in publishing, and I'm sure they're very, very bad. But I do. But I do feel it is a really robust form because it is very capacious and it takes in a lot, and you can bash it up and it still persists in some way. I think novelists for a long time have felt like they were speaking from the margins of the culture. I don't know that this is the first moment that there's been a crisis. And I don't think that actually was your question. I think it was much less pessimistic than that. But that's kind of what I think. I mean, yeah, there's something unifying about the novel as a form, so that it can be written by multiple people and still be a single thing, and that's quite powerful, precisely in an age where there's so much fragmentation.
Yeah, my favorite quote about the novel, which always gives me some sort of optimism, is by Mikhail Bakhtin, and that is the novel is an omnivorous form, and it can eat all the other things and bring them, and we're hearing about those existence of edible things in this conversation and in these writers' books.
Yeah, so anyone can take this one, but I'm just wondering, sort of with those of you who have written novels that sort of engage with these other forms of narration, like Jennifer, PowerPoints, and I know you have a lot of other really fascinating forms that you use in the Candy House and the Visit from the Good Squad. And Tess, I remember like reading your novel and the chats on the funeral website. Those chapters were always really fascinating to me. I guess I'm wondering, when you're experimenting with these other forms of narration and telling a story, especially when like online forms involve so many different voices coming together and contributing, like how much time do you spend online sort of just like reading through like comments and you know, Twitter threads and things like that to sort of get a sense of how you want to use that form to structure the story that you want to tell?
Yeah, so how much online time to research?
My favorite source of inspiration is like off the beaten track comment sections. So I actually have I think I am particularly like allergic to social media. I'm back on it now, it's terrible. But I was off it for a while. But I think I'm really drawn to these kinds of less, like more sort of cult-like, not cult-like, just really particular corners of the internet. And so when I got the idea for the obituary chapter, I was on a lot of obituary guest books online. And I was specifically interested in like minor celebrities who were not known to the public but were known to a cult following, and those people had these extreme senses of connection to the figures that they were mourning, and yet obviously what they were expressing was, they didn't know the people in question, so there was this really interesting distance, but that produced sometimes humor, sometimes tragedy, and that was really interesting to me. So yeah, I think time online generally can be incredibly corrosive to your attention and your imagination, but these like off the beaten track little paths here and there are very enriching and energizing for me.
And I would just add that I think, as with working in any genre, including a digital genre, you really sort of can't do it if you don't know the genre. So for example, when I first had the idea of using PowerPoint, I didn't really know what PowerPoint was, I have to confess. And so I said to friends who worked in the corporate world, I'd love to learn more about what you do. Maybe you could send me a PowerPoint. So they did, and I learned that I couldn't even open the PowerPoint because I didn't have PowerPoint. And then I learned that it was very expensive and I didn't have enough memory, so I thought, you know what, I don't need all this, I'm gonna just do it. I sort of got that it was a slideshow, so I write fiction by hand because that's what gets me my best material. So my first attempt at PowerPoint was drawing rectangles on a legal pad and trying to like make magic happen, and nothing happened. So in the end, I had to buy the memory, buy PowerPoint, and immerse myself in PowerPoints, and that was the only way to do it. So it does require some real knowledge, and I actually got kind of excited about PowerPoint at one point. And I was like, these charts, I love the names, a waterfall chart, it's such a beautiful name. Beautiful chart, bubble charts, so I was totally caught up in it.
It sounds like some sort of karmic punishment.
That reminded me, I once on a plane watched Dan Brown's like masterclass on how to write a thriller, because I was curious. And one of the things he says is, you don't have, now with the internet, you don't have to go to the Taj Mahal to set a whole novel there. And I was like, well, maybe you should go.
Well, I think that's a good point to wrap up. Can we thank Tess, Katie, and Jenny? Thank you all for being here. It's so nice to have a very full crowd. Can I take a picture of you all before you get up, and hopefully have some books to sign, and want to get a drink afterwards? That would be great, but I'm going to quick take a picture of you.
I know to do the level 0.5.
Yeah, do a selfie. Turn yourself around.
Do a selfie. Okay, 1 second. All right, click that, and now, selfie. Hold on. Let's go. iPhone 3, iPhone 1.
You can do it, Dad.
1. There it is. 2, 3, thank you. We'll get a wine. If you bought a $5 ticket, it goes to a book or to wine. So do that and come say hi.
Hi everyone, some housekeeping. We would love for you to join us downstairs in the wine bar to get your books signed and stay for a glass of wine or coffee. You can purchase the books downstairs to the left at the checkout, and then we will have a signing line. Thanks again for joining us. Congrats to Chris on episode 150.
I just want to say one quick thing is I know how hard booksellers work at a city bookstore like this, how busy it is, how intense it is, and you all have been fantastic, and I just want to make sure we give a shout out to booksellers in general, but here at McNally Jackson.
And if you want to hear these audio glitches again, tune in to you.